Welcome to a special Halloween edition of Back to the Feature, the show where we talk about movies past, present, and future. I'm your host, Slade Wilson, and I'm joined by
Kylo Ren.
and we talk about the 1978 classic, Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Here at Back to the Feature, we're going back into the past. Very special episode. We're talking about John Carpenter's Halloween. Halloween tells the story of a 6-year-old, Michael Myers, who stabs his sister on Halloween night. He's later admitted to an insane asylum, which he escapes to return to Haddonfield and the scene of his first murder. So as you guys know, we're doing 31 days of horror, and to cap it off, we're doing Halloween on Halloween. It felt like the perfect choice for the list. So today we're going to do a little in-depth look at John Carpenter's classic. We've had other John Carpenter movies on this list, like The Thing, which is probably my personal favorite John Carpenter movie, but this has got to be a close second in his best movies of all time.
Yeah, it's actually funny that you say that too, because I actually have watched Halloween for the first time recently. I mean, I've seen bits and pieces of it throughout the years on cable television, but I never watched frame for frame, start to finish, until this past month. And this movie is actually really, really excellent. You can tell that it set the stage for basically the entire genre, slasher genre. I actually like that I've watched this movie recently instead of before all the slasher movies that I watched, because it's definitely a movie that's been imitated time and time and time again. This movie, every slasher film after this one essentially copies the tropes from this film. Even down to the fact where the virgin lives. And if you have sex in a horror movie, you're gonna die. This is the movie that set that. That's the first time it was ever done, and it was not intentional. It was just kind of by accident.
No, yeah, I mean, John Carpenter has had tons of great movies. The earliest one I've seen is Assault on Precinct 13, which is such an interesting and raw crime movie. Just really ultra violent, especially for the time that it came out at. And then of course Escape from New York, which is an absolute action classic with Kurt Russell. Dystopian future movie.
Yeah, it's an awesome movie.
But this is definitely, there's so many things inside this movie that the talent level that John Carpenter has to be able to pull this off and do things in this movie that I think that modern horror movies have forgotten how to achieve. So this movie is an absolute classic. John, what are the positives you got from 1978's Halloween?
Well, it's definitely, you're talking about John Carpenter. He's basically a one-man film team on this one. He composed the music, he wrote and directed it. This was an independent film, and actually one of the most successful independent films, I think, of all time. I think a $300,000 budget, and it made $150 million, after inflation, of course. I think $47 million is what it actually made. Something that John Carpenter accomplishes in this film, and I think what makes it such a classic, is its atmosphere. This film just sets this fear and a setting and its expertly crafted tone. The director of photography that worked on this film is Dean Cundey, and he actually worked with John Carpenter through quite a few films. The Thing, he worked on Escape from New York, and he was a part of the Back to the Future trilogy and Jurassic Park. I love the way that this film, the shadows, there's a lot of emphasis on shadows in this film, and I think that's really important when you're setting up atmosphere inside of a horror film.
No, I'm glad that you mentioned the shadows, because I think that's such an important part of what makes this movie scary. I think one of the biggest positives that I take away from this movie is just how bloodless it is. There isn't tons of blood and gore, but he's able to surprise you while completely avoiding what we call a jump scare. There isn't some big musical cue. Sometimes the scariest things are just Michael's presence just coming into frame, and that's it. I think that they use the shadows just so effectively, the way that he can just pop in and pop out, just this unstoppable killer. Michael Myers is definitely one of the more interesting serial killers or slasher villains that we have. And I think that the movie really services him well by having it be so dark. I remember when we watched it, I was like, no, you got to turn on all the lights for this. Because it's just that movie that you sit down on Halloween, you shut off all the lights, and you just spin this movie.
I love that you mentioned that, because something that I really enjoyed about this film is how unrelatable Michael Myers is, and that was all on purpose by John Carpenter to put this extra effect in the atmosphere. Like all the shots that Mike Myers comes into frame, but it's not his face, it's just his body, and then you hear the breathing over the top of that. It's just like, you don't see that in movies ever, and it was something that John Carpenter created. Fun fact, if you didn't know, the mask that's used in Halloween is actually a Star Trek William Shatner mask that was spray painted white. And they paid $2 for it. That's how limited of a budget they had. They paid $2 for that mask. When we're talking about how iconic this movie is, I think you have to bring up the theme song as well. The theme song for Halloween is something that's instantly recognizable.
You know, another big positive, I think, even though it's a small cast, it's a very good cast, is the first role for Jamie Lee Curtis, who in this movie personifies what is the Scream Queen, as we call it. And then also Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis. I think he's such an interesting character, this character who's trying to track down Michael. He was supposed to be his psychiatrist inside of the psych ward, and is the only one that can kind of like understand Michael or try to get into his head. So he goes to like hunt him down to finish what he started, basically. He feels like he's failed everyone by not just killing this dude already, so he's going to go after Michael and put an end to what he describes as pure evil.
Now, this is actually a really fun fact, but Jamie Lee Curtis is actually the daughter of Janet Leigh. And if you don't know who that is the girl in the shower sequence in Psycho. John Carpenter cast Jamie Lee Curtis as an ultimate tribute to Alfred Hitchcock, and it definitely shows. This is what he wanted. That was his idea for this film, and I love that it really just jump-started the genre. I mean, he jet-propelled it forward. It became a staple of like American pop culture for 30 years or so. We haven't been seeing a lot of slashers lately because it's kind of a dying genre, but you know, hopefully someone like John Carpenter could step up and take over that.
Yeah, honestly, I've never been an enormous fan of slasher movies. Even though I do have to say, though, I think that the Halloween movies in general are kind of the best ones. You know, maybe it's just because it's one of the ones I saw first. You know, late night on Halloween, you know, having a sleepover with some friends, put in a scary movie that you probably shouldn't watch. Now, this movie's an absolute classic, and I bet I'm hard-pressed to find any, but what are some of your negatives for this movie, John?
I actually don't have much written down because there really isn't that many negatives in this film. I think, you know, some of the acting maybe is not all quite there. Also, the film doesn't really have a very complicated plot. It's a very simplistic plot. This film is more of, you know, style over substance, but, I mean, very effective style.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like with some of the performances, they're not gonna like, you know, get any Oscar nominations for this movie, but it definitely it suits the film itself. I don't think we're looking for any kind of like you know, Oscar-worthy performances out of a slasher movie like this. I think though that though at times it's very effective, all of the darkness in this movie, I think sometimes it does tip a little bit to being almost a little too dark and almost indecipherable at some points. But I know that's kind of all part of the game and like all part of what they kind of had to do to make the movie work. But I think that in some ways maybe some of the lighting doesn't quite hold up, but it's also really effective for the movie. So like I think a lot of the negatives really are kind of hinged together with a lot of the positives. They kind of needed to be there in order for this movie to work the way it does.
I think it's budget too. You know, it's budget. It's $300,000. That's not actually that much. I mean, if you look at even movies like The Evil Dead, Evil Dead 2, those are movies that were on a budget very similar, and you can see that it has that aged look because of the small budget.
That's like the catering budget for a modern movie. It's like $300,000 to make an entire movie on that is a bit ridiculous. I mean, in those terms, but I think as we found, especially lately with like Blumhouse horror films and stuff, you don't need to throw tons of money at horror in order for it to work.
We're speaking about the budget of this film. It's actually a fun fact. John Carpenter actually wanted Christopher Lee to play the part of psychiatrist Dr. Sam Loomis, but Christopher Lee turned it down because of how little the pay was. And he actually came out and said in an interview that it was the biggest mistake of his career.
I think whenever you're talking about an iconic movie such as this, there are sequences and moments in movies like this that stick out in your mind forever. So for me personally, my favorite moment has got to be the whole sequence in the daytime where he's following the girls through the neighborhood, and there's that one shot where he just steps into frame and he's just staring at Laurie as she like walks down the street, and you just hear him breathing, and that's it. And it's just so effective. It's like it's all you really need to understand what this guy is all about and what he's there to do. I think it's such an effective and scary scene. It's just a guy stepping into frame. You can't see his face. All you can do is just know that he's staring, and you can hear his breathing, and it's already just unsettling.
It's hard to pick a singular favorite moment in this film because the entire thing is just kind of a trip. You know, John Carpenter really just puts you on this atmospheric trip right through the film. But some of my favorite things that go on in the movie is the tricks that John Carpenter plays on your mind while you're watching it. Mike Myers steps into frame here and there in the background. At nighttime, he's all of a sudden in the window, then all of a sudden he's not. Sometimes you're expecting him to be in the window, and he's not there. But your mind is being tricked into thinking that. I probably would say my favorite moment is like the first kill scene in the house. When the guy goes to the door to shut it, and he's in the closet, and he like steps out and just staples him to the door. It's scary, you know. It's just like oh shit, like he's in the room there now, and he was just outside. You don't know where he is, you know. John Carpenter is such an excellent director, and he puts Mike Myers almost in like this ether inside the screen.
No, you bring up a great point. I think there's a bunch of scenes in this movie that John Carpenter just stages excellently. I think there's this one in the kitchen with, Annie, and she's grabbing the things that she needs in the kitchen, and the camera's just sort of panning and following her, and Michael Myers is in the background of the window, and just in a split second it pans back and he's just gone. It just shows just how strong of a director that John Carpenter is and how he can do so much with just so little. Alright, so we've talked about some of the positives and the negatives of this movie. We've talked about some of our favorite iconic moments. So now it's time for our final summaries and grades. John, what's your final summary and grade for 1978's Halloween?
This film jump-started an era of horror films. This lit John Carpenter's career and really set the standard for horror movies going into the 80s. This movie is scary, intense, and most of all, atmospheric. It delivers a perfect horror film that is unique and original for its time. Michael Myers is the perfect boogeyman thanks to John Carpenter. This film is a classic. I'm going to be watching it tonight, so I hope you guys are watching it tonight as well. I give this movie an A.
John Carpenter's Halloween is an absolute horror classic. It introduced us to the character of Michael Myers, who has lived on through decades of horror movies. It also introduced us to Jamie Lee Curtis and jump-started her career. This movie also jump-started the career of John Carpenter. Everyone only knew him from Assault on Precinct 13, this raw, crime, almost blaxploitation movie that had come out during the 70s. This movie opened the door to so many great movies that we got after it. I also give this movie an A.
This has been day 31 of our 31 Days of Horror. I hope you've been following all month long here at Back to the Feature. Remember to like and subscribe on YouTube at Back to the Feature. Comment down below and tell us what you think of our costumes and of the movie Halloween. Also remember to follow us on Twitter at Back2Feature. We'll talk horror movies with you guys all year round. I've been your host, Giovanni Carlo.
And I'm John Vandaloo.
And we'll see you guys next time.